Look at some of the definitions that are important around FSPs, then you'll see that there's a number of these terms that are defined in Schedule 1 of the Act that are really useful for you to unpack who it is that is doing what in terms of how the legislation looks at this. And this is particularly important when we start looking at representatives. Now, Alan is going to unpack the whole situation about representatives and then in more particular, the juristic representatives for us.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Shireen. In the unconventional financial services arena, and by unconventional, these are the ones that Michelle mentioned, motor dealers, travel insurers, retailers, also carriers, transport carriers, and auditors and accountants. The role and the responsibilities of representatives differ distinctly from the roles and responsibilities of juristic representatives and representatives in general in the conventional arena. And I think an example will explain what I mean. But before I get to the example, I'd just like to go back to some basic definitions, which when we look at the Act, the old adage of, when all else fails, consult the handbook. It applies here more often than most people imagine. So I just need to look at, I'd like to show two examples of these definitions. The first one is the definition of a financial services provider itself. And that means any person, and here I've underlined the words other than a representative. Now that particular exclusion from the definition of a financial services provider is a very important exclusion. But it's any person who renders financial services, that is, he provides or furnishes advice, he furnishes intermediary service, or he furnishes both advice and intermediary service. The reason for that exclusion is because of the use of the words in the Act itself. The second definition that is important is the definition of the representative, and it means any person, including any person employed or mandated by the financial service provider, to render financial services for or on behalf, again important words, the financial service provider in terms of the conditions of employment or any other mandate. And I emphasize those words because it is those words that have been used to manage this relationship to a very considerable degree. And then the third definition that is important is the definition of the word person. And here person is defined as any natural person or any trust, and includes a company registered in terms of any law, and any body or persons, corporate or unincorporated. In other words, the Act contemplates that both the FSP may be a natural person or a company or a trust or a body, corporate or unincorporated, but also that representatives may be individuals, natural people, or companies or trusts or bodies, corporate or unincorporated. Now, in the conventional environment, a financial service provider who has representatives, those representatives form part of the business of the financial service provider. His primary or probably his sole activity is rendering financial services. And we take, for example, a brokerage. If the broker appoints a representative, whatever the broker does forms part of the business of that particular FSP. If the brokerage decides to open a branch in a different town, it may open that branch as a Pty Limited or a closed corporation, in which event they will then register that branch as a juristic representative of the main FSP. But whatever they do, they're very closely involved with one another. They share clients, they share information, they share techniques, they share disclosures. In the unconventional environment, this is not the case. And I'll use the motor dealer environment as an example. In this instance, the financial service provider in question itself seldom renders any form of financial service. In fact, its primary function is to appoint representatives who render financial services in the field. And these representatives may, in most instances, be spread all over the country. Here, those representatives, generally juristic representatives, don't even know who their fellow representatives in the company are. They operate independently of one another, and to some extent independently of the FSP itself. The financial service provider manages them to a greater or lesser degree. He ensures that they have the proper disclosures, the proper procedures, that the people involved are fit and proper, and so on and so forth. But the actual day-to-day operation of that representative in the unconventional environment is different in that that representative is operating independently. He seems to be on his own, And it is from this relationship that the concern has arisen that what is happening is that licenses are being rented. So the renter license environment has come about because of this particular way the situation has been managed. There's a number of reasons why in the unconventional environment this would be done. And to do this, we need to look very carefully at the nature of a mandate. The regulator has always regarded the appointment of a representative as the appointment of as an agent of the financial services provider. But by the language and the description of a representative in the Act, the word mandate is included. And if we look at the law in South Africa, a mandate cannot in general be classified as a form of agency, since it is an entirely different legal base. Mandate is a consensual contract in terms of which the mandatory, that is the juristic representative, acts in accordance with the authority of the mandator. That's all. There's no establishment of an agency agreement necessarily. So we ask the question in that case, why is this particular format, why is this particular practice so popular in the unconventional arena? And the main reason is because, by and large, the representatives and juristic representatives of unconventional FSPs are also involved in the collection of premiums in one form or another. We'll deal in more detail with premium collection at a later presentation, but the main reason that this is used is because of the provisions primarily of Section 19 of the Act, Board Notice 123 of 2009, and Board Notice 106 of 2008, and I'll deal very briefly with those. Section 19 says that a provider who collects all providers rather, must have proper accounting systems and must have these accounts audited on an annual basis. They may apply for an exemption from the need to have them audited, provided they do not collect premiums. The Act applies to the provider. It does not apply to the representative. So if a provider appoints a representative and the provider itself does not collect premiums, but the representative does, then there's no requirement in any form or manner for either the provider or the representative to have an auditor. Secondly, the Board Notice 123 of 2009, the Board Notice in terms of which professional indemnity cover is required, every financial service provider must have PI cover. But if the provider collects premiums, then he must also hold fidelity insurance cover. If the representative collects premiums, then the only requirement is that the FSP has the professional indemnity cover. There is no requirement that the juristic representative hold any form of professional indemnity or fidelity cover. And then finally, another aspect which we'll deal with in more detail is that in terms of Board Notice 106 of 2008, the fit and proper Board Notice as amended, the financial soundness requirements apply to the provider only. They do not apply to the representative in any form. And this makes the appointment of representatives to collect premiums a very much more convenient and a far less onerous, from a regulatory point of view, system. One of the issues that often is, the question is often asked is this: if I'm a financial services provider and I have my representatives are all motor dealers, why should I appoint the dealership as the juristic representative? Why don't I just appoint the finance and insurance manager, the F&I manager in the dealership, by mandate that particular individual as a representative? And the answer is this: if the particular F&I only renders financial services in terms of which she sells the product, she gives advice or an intermediary service that results in the product being purchased by the client, then all that needs to be done is that that person needs to be authorized as a representative. But the minute the dealership itself is able to collect premiums and does collect premiums, which is the norm, then that dealership must be registered as a juristic representative, because they are rendering an intermediary service. They are collecting and accounting for premiums. And in practice, this is not often, but frequently enough, overlooked. And only the F&I has been appointed as a representative, but the dealership continues to collect premiums. This is problematic in the extreme.
Alan, before you continue, I see we've got a question. If we can just go back and explain exactly what a juristic representative is. So what is the difference between a representative and a juristic representative?
Yeah. Well, if a financial service provider appoints somebody who's not employed by that financial service provider, they have to mandate that person. So if they wish to appoint a company or a closed corporation as a representative, that has to be done by way of mandate. But there has to be a human being who is the face of that particular entity. So the juristic representative, who is now the entity that is responsible for delivering those services, does this through the agency of a human being who is probably employed by that particular juristic representative. So it's a company or a corporate entity that is the representative and that carries the responsibilities of the representative. And the key individual of the juristic representative, not the key individual of the juristic representative is the human face, the person who actually does the work for that juristic representative.
So, Alan, if I could try and give an example, if I was the FSB and Michelle and Velashni work for the same other legal entity, then it would be quite possible that Michelle's, let's just say that I'm a car dealer and Michelle is also running a car dealership. I could be appointing Michelle's cars as my juristic representative on my representative register because I'm the FSB, I'm the authorized financial services provider, and I have license number 0000. It doesn't exist, so you can go and look that up. So on my rep register, you'll see Michelle's cars as a juristic representative, but Michelle will then be appointed as the key individual of that juristic representative on my representative register, and Velashni, who's the F&I, the finance and insurance person, will be listed as a representative on my representative register. Remember, Michelle's cars isn't an FSP, so she will not have her own representative register. That representative register will be in my name as Shireen's cars.
That is 100% correct. If that happens, if there's more than one person in the employ or working for the juristic representative who is acting as a representative, then there has to be a separate mandate agreement in each instance. So the one mandate agreement will mandate the juristic entity who will appoint a key individual, and there will be a second mandate agreement for the person who's also acting as a representative. And there can be as many representatives as is necessary. If it's a huge dealership with 5 or 6 F&Is, there would be 5 or 6 separate mandate agreements between the FSP and each one of those individuals and the juristic entity.
We've seen it that some of these juristic representatives could have numerous people in that entity actually acting as representatives, and all of them then have to appear on the representative register of the actual FSB.
Yep.
In a call center environment, for instance, you would find that numerous people, actually up to hundreds of people, could be listed as representatives.
That is correct, and I think that is one of the areas where a great deal of attention should be applied, is the people who are employed by the juristic representative is to determine very carefully whether or not they are in fact acting as representatives, whether they're interacting with clients in any manner that can be determined as rendering of a financial service, and the definition of a financial service, both advice and intermediary service, is very, very wide. It speaks of any act that leads to the acquisition of a product. So if those particular individuals within that juristic representative exercise any form of judgment and that they interact with clients that results in the acquisition of a financial product, it is very probable that they are or should be registered as representatives as well, and should be properly mandated, because they can't be employed by the FSP, but they need to be properly mandated and included on the register of representatives of that FSP.
We've got another question before we carry on, and I'm very glad that we're getting questions, because it does say that we're talking about the issues that are relevant to you. So the question is, what about representatives who sell funeral products? You cannot appoint the entity because the key individual of the juristic rep will never be fit and proper, but as an individual you would be able to appoint them as a normal representative.
Yes.
That's a really relevant question.
Yes.
What do you do if this entity doesn't have people who would meet the requirements to be a key individual? Alan, what would be your advice as a compliance officer?
It would depend on if the entity itself could be deemed to be rendering any form of financial service. For example, it collects or manages premiums, handles claims or anything, then that entity has to be a juristic representative. To mandate the individuals within an organization without also mandating that organization is in practice, I think, a very problematic situation. I have difficulty one would have to look at it, the factual basis of this thing, but I personally think that it would be very, very difficult to mandate somebody who's employed or is fully operational within a separate entity, to mandate him as your representative and expect him to be able to operate independently and as a representative without the cooperation of his employer. And if his employer is not a juristic representative, I'm not sure that that cooperation is possible.
Okay. From a regulator perspective, ladies, have you come across this?
Well, not really.
Okay. Obviously, this is based in general, and we would need to unpack this in specific situations. So if this is your specific situation, please contact me afterwards. I am back in the office tomorrow, and you're more than welcome to give me a call, and I'll happily talk to you about this and see how we can sort this out. But in general, I would say that the FSB, who is the authorized financial services provider, has an approved key individual. And you could always look at having that person act as the key individual of the juristic representative, and then appointing the people in the juristic representative as representatives. However, there are very practical and operational issues that has to be considered before this can be done. For instance, let me use myself as an example again, and let me just pick for a moment on Alan, because I haven't picked on him yet. So Alan, you're running a funeral parlor and you can't be the key individual because you don't meet the requirements. If I am, as the key individual of the actual FSP, going to act as the key individual of the juristic representative, which is now Alan's business, then I need to have the operational ability to actually manage and oversee the rendering of the financial services at the juristic representative. And I need to be able to do this on a regular basis. Now, if I am based in Johannesburg and Alan is based in Knysna, then this is going to be pretty difficult for me to do. Yes. Because just the logistical differences between us, thousands of kilometers, I'm not there on a daily basis, I have other work to do, means that I'm not necessarily going to be able to do that. But if we were physically based in the same building or 3 streets apart, it may be a lot more feasible to happen. Now, this is just one of the considerations that you've got to take into account before you make decisions like that. But we are going to be unpacking operational ability during the course of this session. But here, one of the questions that is relevant to the key individual is Section 8.8 of Board Notice 106 of 2008, the Determination of Fit and Proper Requirements, says that a key individual must have the operational ability to manage and oversee the rendering of the financial services. And this is the question that we as the regulator would ask the key individual. What is your operational ability? What else are you responsible for? How do you stay in touch with that business that you are managing and overseeing? How do you manage and oversee so many people, for instance? So these are the questions that you've got to be able to answer for yourself before you make a business decision like this. Do you want to add?
Just to mention, as the registrar, there is no magic number that we can give to you. So we can't say that as a key individual, you need to have oversight and management of 8 representatives. It depends on what those representatives are doing, where they are geographically based, and a whole host of other elements that we need to take into consideration. Therefore, for you to ask us as the registrar, what number do we think is appropriate, we will not be able to give you a definitive response on that one.
Excellent, thank you. We're getting questions, so before we carry on, let's deal with the questions. Do trainees or learners who sometimes deal with clients need to register as representatives? Balashni?
Yes, they do need to register as representatives, but they need to disclose, which I am going to deal later on in my presentation, with regard to their acting under supervision. And you must also know as well that in terms of supervision, there needs to be a person who's fit and proper, which is normally the KI, who oversees that type of financial services rendered.
Thank you. And then the last question for now, and I don't know what the answer is. What is a super representative?
Is it not a representative under supervision, possibly? Maybe if you could ask the person who asked that question to maybe clarify.
Super.
Yeah. We don't actually have a term, super representative. So if this is something that is used in industry, please let us know. We really don't know. You're welcome to come back with more information about that question. Alan, back to you.
Well, that's really most of what I have to say about representatives. I think just to go back to the earlier question about a funeral parlour where the actual entity, the individual within the parlour has not been able to become sufficiently qualified. The appointment of some other person outside of that agency, it's a fairly common practice in the unconventional environment where the rendering of financial services is not the main business. And I think there it can be argued that an external key individual of a juristic representative is more able to manage because of the limited amount of business. But in a funeral parlour, to have a key individual of an FSB who's situated, say, in Johannesburg, as the key individual of a juristic representative situated in Knysna, who is doing business on a day-to-day, moment-to-moment basis, I think it would be practically very difficult to manage and to satisfy the operational ability requirements of the Board Notice 106. So, again, but a question of fact, of the circumstances in the particular instance, how does it work? And the answer will be given around these principles.
And I think that's really important that we understand exactly what the responsibilities are of FSB towards its juristic representatives and who takes that responsibility. Now remember, the key individual is always important. Michelle, can you just unpack a little bit of the key individual's responsibilities?
Okay. The key individual is responsible for ensuring that the representatives or the key individuals of the juristic representatives appointed are fit and proper. So they need to ensure that the registrar has the first layer of compliance, which is the key individual. The key individual then has to mirror that level of compliance onto the representatives and juristic reps. So basically what we're trying to say is that whatever the registrar expects of the FSP needs to have those same expectations of their representatives and or juristic reps.
Thank you very much. And we've got clarification, so thank you very much for the person who sent the clarification through on what a super representative is. And they say that some people refer to the key individuals of juristic representatives as super representatives. Thank you for that. It's not an official term. And I would be very hesitant to use terminology that ends up confusing people. Now, remember, the key individual of a juristic representative needs to meet exactly the same requirements as the key individual of an FSP. The only difference is that the key individual of the FSP needs to be approved by the Financial Services Board. So you would actually send an application with all the supporting document, references, qualifications, examinations, etc., through to the registrations department at the FSB. And they would then consider this and then present it for approval by the licensing committee. Now, when you appoint the key individual of a juristic representative, you have to go through the same checks. You have to check the person's experience. You have to check their qualifications. You have to check that they've met all the relevant regulatory examination requirements. And then only can you submit their appointment as a key individual of the juristic representative to the registrar. But note the difference. You submit their appointment, you don't ask for approval. Because as Michelle has said, the key individual of the FSP is now responsible for checking the fit and proper status of the representatives. And it includes the representatives and the key individuals of the juristic representatives. So we don't actually approve that key individual. But apart from that, everything else needs to mirror the key individual of the FSP itself. And you have to check this on an ongoing basis. Now,